Hello, welcome and thanks for watching this introduction to our workshop on unsettling multilingualism, insights from non-polyglossic communities around the globe. I'm Jill Vaughan and this is Ruth Singer, and we're both linguists based at the Research Unit for Indigenous Language at the University of Melbourne. We also both work with Indigenous communities in Northern Australia to document and support their languages and their language ecologies. And despite quite different research trajectories in our own research, we've both found ourselves interested in documenting multilingualism in the Arnhem Land region of Northern Australia in the past 5 or so years. And in doing so, we've connected with a broader community of researchers who are also working in the still fairly new field of small-scale multilingualism. But the field has been rapidly growing, becoming more fleshed out, both in terms of regions that are included around the world, and also in terms of its rigour as a field being associated with new methods and exciting new questions. So in this workshop, we intended to draw together some new research from communities around the world where many languages coexist within long-standing multilingual ecologies. And together the contributions are intended to continue to unsettle dominant polyglossia-centric models of multilingualism, which I'll discuss in a moment, and to contribute to really trying to globalise the field. So although the field has somewhat coalesced under the umbrella of the small-scale multilingualism label, other terms have been variously used for the same or for related contexts, and none is perfect or totally encapsulating, including small-scale multilingualism itself, but each picks out some sort of salient property of the kinds of ecologies that we are talking about. So the term non-polyglossic multilingualism contrasts these language ecologies with more, perhaps more familiar and certainly more dominant models of multilingualism that have been well described in many Western and urban contexts. And these are too often taken to be the default or the sort of universal model of multilingualism, when in fact there are many communities around the globe where these hierarchical models of multilingualism that are very often naturalized by nation states actually play more of a marginal role. And so for those of you who might be perhaps new to the area, diglossia or polyglossia refers to a hierarchical model of multilingualism where languages tend to develop domain specialization or differing evaluations of prestige within a larger model. And Joshua Fishman proposed polyglossia actually just as one of several kinds of societal multilingualisms. But because none of the other kinds of societal multilingualisms have ever really been elaborated into fully fledged models, alternatives can and have been rendered invisible almost by the ubiquity of that polyglossia model. And then there have also been other useful terms like egalitarian multilingualism and convivial multilingualism that have been introduced to evoke the kinds of typical relations between languages and speakers in these settings. So the kinds of language ecologies we're talking about are characterised by a set of interconnected features. So for example, you might have multiple languages spoken by small groups of people, and these people are multilingual in each other's languages. As I've mentioned, the languages are not subject to a strict social hierarchy or domain separation. In some of these contexts, labels for varieties, language names, can act as shifters. There's some flexibility there, or as Friederike Lübke puts it, as notional and ideological reference points. Another property of many of these settings is the operation of regional systems. So this is where multilingual practices are sort of connected and interdependent at a broader scale than just the individual community. But it's also been noted that generalizations like this can obscure sometimes the fine details of diversity or diversities within a region. And so sometimes the focus on micro regions can be necessary. Also the presence of various kinds of multilingual practices, for example, receptive multilingualism, where each interlocutor maintains their own language in an interaction. Now, crucially, not all contexts will show all of these features, and we'll return to this point again. This isn't intended to be any kind of a laundry list of features that must be ticked off to qualify. While there are very much important commonalities that are observable, there are also significant diversities that exist across communities and regions. And we also note that these kinds of ecologies tend to exist at global peripheries, so the edges of imperial, colonial, and globalizing projects. So another thing that's been noted in work in this area is the central role of language ideologies, both pre-contact, pre-existing, and also newly emergent ideologies that support and shape these ecologies. And it's also often noted that language practices and ideologies are in some way mutually constituting. They're very much interconnected and interdependent. Again, it's not that every ideology is present in every community, but some that have come up time and time again in different research in this area is the fact that language and territory and language and identity may be tightly intertwined. It's not necessarily a given though. Work by Crossgritty, for example, has shown that this isn't always the case, but many small-scale multilingualism communities do indeed make this equation between the two. And these are connected to the idea of linguistic nationalism. So this is a sort of powerful and virtually inescapable ideology that's very often discussed in analyses of languages in the state. But here we see the same processes playing out at a much smaller scale. We also see the operation of and ideologies around patrilineal inheritance of languages across many of these communities. And this kind of language ideology goes against some assumptions about the primacy of the mother tongue in a lot of multilingualism research. So often actually language socialization in these contexts has a strong focus on avoiding the mother's language in some cases, or even when the matrilict may be ideologically central, it might not necessarily be spoken. Another commonly observed distinction within language ideology is difference between using and understanding a language, between speaking a language versus being able to just hear it. So this points to a relationships that individuals are expected to have to different languages within their repertoire, and these might be different depending on lots of factors such as where they inherit those languages from. Interactions with colonial regimes may differ very much. So many local ideologies have developed aspects of what is more of a polyglossic model following contact with a colonial regime. And another thing that's very commonly observed is that diversity in these settings following interaction with these regimes may be viewed as a problem, as a logistical headache, or as a barrier to English acquisition. And as I mentioned before, this label, small-scale multilingualism, does not imply a single homogeneous type of language ecology. So now just to give you a few examples and to bring to life a little bit these kinds of ecologies, and also to bring to life some of the diversities within these ecologies, I'm going to borrow a series of multilingual episodes or vignettes from two recent roundtable talks that were hosted by Ilara and that were organised and facilitated by Friederike Lübke. You can see the titles there. So this brought together researchers who look at small-scale multilingualism in different settings. One talk about the Pacific space and one about the Africa, Amazonia and Atlantic space and small-scale multilingual communities within these. So in the first example that I want to give, this comes from researcher Kofi Yakpo. He's a researcher from the University of Hong Kong, and he works especially on Afro-Caribbean English lexifier Creoles on both sides of the Atlantic. And he conjures up this very interesting episode in a backyard in rural Ghana, where a group of men belonging to a loose family network are gathered. They're speaking in Ghanaian pidgin. This is typical of informal settings, and they drop phrases in Akan. And Akan is a language that about 80% of Ghana's population can speak. Within this context, one of the men receives a phone call and switches entirely to Akan. At another moment, Kofi's sister-in-law appears and asks in Ghanaian Standard English if anybody wants a drink. At another moment, one of the group brings out his instrument and sings a song in his own language, a language of Ghana called frafra, which only some of the men understand, so he has to unpack some of the meaning of that song. And then at another moment, to highlight something like a punchline, one of the men switches to another language of the region, Ewe. So this gives you a sense of the diversity and the dynamism within these contexts. In another example, this one given by Paddy Epps, a researcher who works in the Upper Rio Negro region of Brazil, particularly. In this interaction, or in this context, there's extensive contact between two groups of people, the Hup and the Tucano people. But bilingualism is one-sided. So the Hup people speak Tucano, but not the other way around. We're at a drinking party hosted by the Hup community, and a number of Tucano men show up. The Hup people only speak Tucano with them, but do complain about them using the Hup language. And while this pattern is adhered to rigidly at first, as more drinking occurs, more mixing occurs. So intersentential switching between Hup, Tucano, and Portuguese is something that develops as the drinking goes on. So here we have a great deal of diversities across settings, but also diversities within these communities. So just briefly, some quick questions and controversies and challenges that have been raised within this field. So contact and mixing between languages is certainly a point of interest, with different paths observed for different kinds of diffusion and contact, different code mixing practices. The field has been interested in the interaction of multilingualism and the development of diversity, the nature of boundary maintenance between languages, tensions between convergence and divergence, the role of variation, and also the idea of accommodation in interaction, which is supposedly a universal based in this sort of psychological idea of preferring something that's similar to you yourself. But a lot of the work in small-scale multilingualism presents challenges to this idea. So here you can see a map presenting some of the major work in small-scale multilingualism in recent times. You can pause the recording and have a look at each of these regions and the people involved, and also draw your attention to the Crossroads project and the Wellsprings project, which looked at areas in Western Africa and also in Northern Australia. So why is it important to focus on small-scale multilingualism at all, given, as we've said, there's so much diversity across these settings, but also given some criticisms of work in this area that maybe a typology of multilingualisms might actually be more appropriate than kind of distinguishing between small-scale versus non-small-scale settings. Well, one of the major reasons is that it's been very useful for researchers to link together these different settings, which have some similarities, but which also have differences from more recognized and well-described kinds of multilingualism. So as a counter, for example, to work in sociolinguistic complexity and superdiversity, which has framed multilingualism of these kinds as a new phenomenon developed in the West, in urban settings and so on, as a product of increasing mobility and diversity. Actually, this research shows that these conditions have long existed in more peripheral language communities, and they've just kind of gone mainstream in some ways. It also allows us to centralize the need to unlearn assumptions, sometimes from linguistic nationalism, about how social and linguistic groups map onto each other, because of the ubiquity and this unconscious commitment that we have to linguistic nationalism, even as researchers within the field. I hand over to Ruth now.
Thanks, Jill. I'm going to talk about some new developments in the last couple of years. So we've seen some new questions raised. For example, can we have a lot of small languages in an area without small-scale multilingualism? So without people speaking large numbers of each other's languages. And can small-scale multilingualism sometimes just be a transitional stage, for example, brought about by forced settlement due to colonization? Other things people are looking at is the historical record. So what kind of signals would we expect small-scale multilingualism to leave in the historical record if it existed long-term, for example, for millennia, which has been argued for many areas, Or if there was just a short period of small-scale multilingualism, for example, post-colonisation, how would this influence the languages? We've also seen people taking new approaches and connecting work in small-scale multilingualism to other ways of working in other fields. So, for example, work in Cameroon on relational identities using methods of spatial analysis. And also extending linguistic biography interviews by looking back through the generations and asking people about how their parents spoke and their grandparents spoke, and using that to construct a sort of apparent time system. Also using sociolinguistic questionnaires, which is something the new GrammarDapt project is doing, to try and compare across large numbers of settings. And also applying understandings of small-scale multilingualism to educational policy, like the Liliema project. One of the things we wanted to try and talk about in this workshop was decolonising small-scale multilingualism. By definition, small-scale multilingualism is found in communities which have resisted being completely assimilated into larger groups. So generally not part of the more dominant group of their region or their nation. In terms of decolonising ways of working with people on the ground, researchers in the area of small-scale multilingualism have done very well in developing new ways of collaborating with communities in fieldwork through training local people and co-authoring. But in other areas, there's still quite a lot to do. And because it's such a new field of research, small-scale multilingualism offers the opportunity to look at how we can move further away from colonial traditions in ways of doing linguistic research. So one of the areas where I think we struggle is in comparison and abstraction. So researchers have found it very useful to compare across these different contexts, which we've been grouping under the name small-scale multilingualism. We've been sharing ideas about methods, and analyses of linguistic ideologies, all different types of aspects of what we're doing, and that's sort of what's created this new field. But when we enter into these realms of abstraction and comparison, we become unmoored from our community level collaborations that we're each involved with, which are shaped by local notions of relationality. So how can we perhaps not lose those and work against the tendencies that comparative kinds of work have to emulate colonial projects of domination through classifying different people in different regions? So one of the ideas is engaging more with Indigenous scholars. And this is why we've asked Jenny Davis, a Chickasaw scholar from the United States, to be the discussant on this panel. And we're really interested to see her reflections on it. She's written about how abstraction can lead to essentializing and how there's a tendency, certainly that has been established in anthropology too, to romanticize the small scale and the exotic. Also, another direction that would be really fruitful is to extend our understandings of small-scale multilingualism to challenge ideas about multilingualism and what it is, and better support community goals around language. So, for example, Pierpaolo Di Carlo has been working in multilingual education and health programs, and Frederica Lipka has been working in support for vernacular literacy, so developing writing systems which can be used across languages so that people can reflect their own multilingual speech without having to switch between different orthographies. Also, support for local language activism, which a lot of research is involved with, countering the dominant deficit discourses which plague colonial talk about Indigenous people, which is certainly rife in Australia and something we have to continually try and work against. Another useful direction would be better reflection of diverse multilingualisms within academia. So countering the monolingual biases and discourses that are in operation. We could have better engagement with scholarship from the point of view of speakers and signers, and with Indigenous perspectives on the role of language work and how it can align with communities' own self-determined goals. So we're really looking forward to hearing all the talks in the panel. and we're excited about the new directions that all these different presenters are taking this field, and we hope that you'll join us in listening to them all.